everyone, welcome to our morning edition of Arirang News. We begin with these stories making the headlines at this hour. With just a couple of hours before the tariffs go into effect, U.S. President Donald Trump signed an executive order for new rates. The White House also noted that the deal with South Korea allows significant investment for the U.S. and historic market access to American goods. Top diplomats from South Korea and the United States met in Washington, making it the first foreign ministerial meeting since President Lee took office last month. The Lee Jae-myung administration unveiled its first tax reform plan, aimed at encouraging corporate payouts and boosting the stock market. Hours before reciprocal tariffs were set to take effect, U.S. President Donald Trump said Washington had made more trade deals. Meanwhile, the White House announced that Washington will raise its tariffs for Canadian goods from 25% to 35%, while another 90-day extension will be in place for Mexico. Our Lee Jae starts us off.
Just hours before reciprocal tariffs were set to take effect, U.S. President Donald Trump announced on Thursday that Washington had made some more trade deals. Speaking at an executive order signing ceremony at the White House, Trump told reporters that his trade deals are making trillions of dollars for his country, highlighting what he described as significant economic wins. Trump later announced a 25% tariff for India, 20% for Taiwan, and a 30% rate for South Africa. Meanwhile, when asked about failure to reach a trade deal with Canada, Trump addressed speculation, linking the breakdown to Canada's push for recognition of Palestinian statehood.
No, I didn't like what they said, but that's their opinion. I didn't like that. Not a deal breaker, but we haven't spoken to Canada today.
However, shortly afterwards, the White House announced that Canada's tariff rate will be raised from 25% to 35%. The White House said the higher tariffs are in response to continued inaction and retaliation, adding that Trump found it necessary to increase the duties to effectively address the existing emergencies. The Brazilian government on Thursday slammed the Trump administration's decision to impose a 50% tariff on its imports, calling it an unfair measure, and warned of possible retaliation if no resolution is reached. However, Brazil's Finance Minister Fernando Haddad told reporters that the tariff plan is not as bad as expected, adding that the tariffs will also do harm to the American people as it will drive up prices in the U.S. Meanwhile, the Brazilian government cited data from the American Chamber of Commerce in Brazil, noting that 694 Brazilian products exported to the U.S., making up 45% of total exports, are exempt from the tariffs. The new 50% tariffs are expected to impact roughly 35.9% of Brazil's exports to the U.S. Meanwhile, Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum said on Thursday that her government had secured a 90-day extension to work on a trade deal, which will pause new tariffs.
We remain as we are, and it's 90 days to keep talking, holding dialogue, and building a long-term agreement.
Sheinbaum says the extension averted the 30% tariffs that were scheduled to take effect on Friday. She added that the new extension will also allow for Mexico to be exempt from the 25% tariffs imposed by President Trump earlier this year in response to the fentanyl crisis. Lee Jae, Arirang News.
U.S. President Donald Trump has now signed an executive order setting tariffs for trading partners, including South Korea. The White House also officially confirmed that South Korea will face a 15% tariff rate, with the deal providing market access to American goods, including autos and rice. Our Park Jun-an has more.
U.S. President Donald Trump on Thursday local time signed an executive order for the new reciprocal tariffs that take effect on August 1st.
But I do know that the trade team has been working around the clock to try to be in correspondence with as many countries as possible. But if they haven't heard from us yet, they will in the form of a letter or an executive order by midnight tonight.
South Korea on Wednesday secured a last-minute deal to lower the reciprocal tariff from 25% to 15%. White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt said the agreement allows significant investment for the U.S. and historic market access to American goods.
And South Korea will pay a 15% tariff rate, including 15% on autos, while providing historic market access to American goods like autos and rice. Korea will purchase $100 billion in American energy by 2028. And the centerpiece of this deal is that South Korea has agreed to invest $350 billion at the president's direction to revitalize American industry.
U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, speaking on CNBC, described the agreement between South Korea and the U.S. as a very good one. Bessent said, South Korea was a special case because they had an election, a new government. So they were not in the position to fully negotiate. And they presented a very good offer. President Trump moved the offer up a bit, and we reached a very good agreement. On the same day, the White House posted a photo of President Trump with the South Korean U.S. trade delegation to social media, where it called the deal historic. Trump also took to social media to say details on South Korea's investments will be formalized during a visit to the White House by President Lee Jae-myung, set to take place in the next 2 weeks. 박준환, Arirang News.
So we're just a couple of hours away from the reciprocal tariffs taking effect. South Korea and the United States reached a trade deal yesterday, allowing Washington to impose a 15% tariff on Korean imports. For more on this, we're joined by Professor Greg Buchak, Professor of Finance at Stanford Graduate School of Business, Stanford University. Professor Buchak, thanks for joining us this morning.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So high tariffs are set to take effect just after midnight today. So what's your overall assessment of the Trump administration's tariff policy? Do you think pressuring countries has been effective in what he wanted to achieve, such as countering China?
Yeah, so I think Trump's tariff strategy has been fairly blunt force, and as you can see from a lot of the last-minute implementations, a bit chaotically implemented, and I think not actually super well tailored to U.S. strategic interests. So, broadly, there's really three strategic reasons that one might want to impose tariffs. One is kind of obvious. It's raising revenues, and it's true that revenues from tariffs have increased, but the number is actually fairly small relative to the U.S. federal budget. And economists tend to think of tariffs as being sort of a very inefficient way to raise revenue because they distort a lot of economic behavior. Another reason you might do it is to kind of reshore U.S. manufacturing. And the idea is if we make goods imported from foreign countries more expensive for U.S. consumers, they'll have incentives to buy locally, and local producers will be able to sort of compete within the U.S. Now, it's not super obvious why the U.S. wants more like factory workers and less computer programmers, but that's sort of what Trump is aiming for. But the irony in a lot of this of Trump's implementation here is there are actually very high tariffs on raw materials like steel and aluminum, and these are the things that U.S. factories would need to actually produce. So these sort of high tariffs on raw materials kind of run directly counter to this goal of reshoring U.S. manufacturing. And then the final thing that you mentioned, I think, is probably the best justification for this, which is sort of geopolitically countering China. But unfortunately, I also think that the tariff strategy there is a little bit incoherent. If you were trying to target China, what you would do is sort of build a free trade network of U.S. allies like Korea, Japan, Vietnam, and so on, and then try to crack down on transshipment from China. And then together as a sort of free trade coalition, you would then impose tariffs on China as a bloc. By the way, that's actually sort of close to what we got from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was something that was negotiated during the Obama administration that Trump actually threw out during his first term. And instead, Trump is going about it in this sort of haphazard way, tariffing potential allies. The whole thing, to me, seems a little bit incoherent for these goals.
I see. And as for South Korea, Seoul and Washington agreed to lower the tariff rate to 15%, with Seoul promising to invest $350 billion in the United States. The Korean government says the deal puts South Korea on an equal or even better footing than other countries, and that it has helped remove trade uncertainties. What are your thoughts on the agreement compared to the deals Washington has reached with other nations?
I think that's right. So South Korea is sort of at this 15% level, which is the kind of global tariff floor. And as you were hearing earlier in the news reports, there's some countries that have sort of more higher putative tariff rates. So, 15% is sort of good relative to other countries. it's unfortunately higher than what many people would think is ideal, which is actually 0%. But as you mentioned, it's very good to sort of have this ironed out and removing some uncertainty around Korean exports. On paper, this looks very similar to the kinds of deals that the U.S. has with the EU. I think it's particularly important for Korea, which relies so much on exporting things like batteries and automobiles to the U.S., to just have this kind of locked up. As you mentioned, another big part of this that Trump sort of sees as a big win, and hopefully it's mutually beneficial to both countries, is this $350 billion of investment that's spread across things like shipbuilding, semiconductors, energy, biotech, liquid natural gas purchases. It's a really big commitment, and hopefully it ends up being mutually beneficial for the United States and Korea.
I see. All right, Professor Buchak, I'm afraid that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much for your insight. We appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
South Korea's Foreign Minister Cho Hyun met with U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio in Washington on Thursday local time. This was the first foreign ministerial meeting since the launch of the Lee Jae-myung administration. For more on what was talked about and what comes next, we have our correspondent Oh Soo-young on the line. Soo-young, the top diplomats of Seoul and Washington held their first ever discussion at their meeting in D.C. Tell us more.
Good morning to you, Eun-ji. Foreign Minister Cho Hyun and his counterpart Marco Rubio met Thursday afternoon local time, very early in the morning here in Seoul, of course. The two officials appear to have discussed the South Korea-US alliance and broader security issues here in the region. Seoul's foreign ministry says they exchanged views on North Korea, deeming it, quote, necessary to strengthen cooperation on Pyongyang and agreed to an enhanced whole-of-government approach. They also agreed to strengthen trilateral cooperation between South Korea, the US, and Japan based on the Seoul-Washington alliance. Washington's readout focused more on deterrence against North Korea, saying that the two officials reaffirmed resolute commitment to the complete denuclearization of the North. The statement also expressed serious concern over the North's growing military cooperation with Russia and said that Cho and Rubio both committed to the full implementation of international sanctions against Pyongyang. It also positioned the Seoul-Washington trilateral cooperation with Tokyo as an effort to strengthen deterrence against regional threats, while emphasizing the importance of peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait. Now, Rubio and Cho's talks followed the sudden conclusion of trade negotiations by finance and trade officials the day before. Now, the two officials welcomed the bilateral trade agreement and pledged cooperation on supply chains and critical and emerging technologies. Seoul, though, further emphasized a third pillar of partnership in advanced technologies. These include things like artificial intelligence, nuclear energy, and quantum technology, alongside the first and second pillars, which would be security and trade cooperation.
Right, and Soo-young, there's also talk of alliance modernization following the tariff agreement. What's the latest on that?
Good question. Well, security issues were not substantially addressed in the recent trade negotiation that you mentioned happened yesterday. Initially, a so-called package deal covering both trade and security matters was treated in the past. However, discussions on alliance modernizations are expected probably in the weeks to come. The term, of course, refers to adjusting the role and scope of the Korea-US alliance in line with shaping strategic conditions, and as Washington presses its allies to contribute more towards their own security. Both the Foreign Minister and Defense Minister, An Gubek, who held a phone call with his counterpart, Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth, have reportedly discussed alliance modernization. But, of course, no specific outcomes have been announced so far. It is, though, expected that the summit between Presidents Lee Jae-myung and Trump could serve as a starting point, with potential 2+2 ministerial meetings to follow for more detailed discussions on that. Of course, U.S. President Trump stated yesterday that his meeting with EU will take place within the next 2 weeks and reportedly instructed Secretary Rubio to make arrangements without delay. So we can expect him to coordinate with Seoul, including, of course, with Foreign Minister Cho Hyun. Speaking with reporters after their meeting, the South Korean foreign minister said that his talks with Rubio were good and constructive and that talks to prepare the bilateral summit have now begun.
All right, Soo-young, thank you for that report. The government unveiled its tax reform plan to address a substantial shortfall in tax revenue and support economic growth. Our finance correspondent Moon Ji-young explains more.
The 2025 tax reform bill introduces a mix of targeted tax credits for strategic industries and welfare, alongside adjustments to corporate and capital gains taxes.
Over the past 3 years, our tax revenue base has weakened rapidly, leading to a significant drop in the tax burden ratio. Therefore, this year's tax reform bill prioritizes reinforcing the weakened tax revenue base for fiscal sustainability, while also supporting economic strength and stabilizing people's livelihoods.
The reform package aims to enhance tax credits for R&D and investment in future strategic industries, including AI. Furthermore, to enhance K-content competitiveness, tax credits for webtoons will be newly introduced, and tax support for video content creation will be expanded. Beyond these targeted incentives, the framework includes tax cuts designed to encourage corporate payouts and boost the stock market. Specifically, to encourage high dividends, a separate taxation system for dividend income from high dividend companies is being introduced. This approach excludes these dividends from the comprehensive financial income tax base, allowing earnings from stock dividends to be taxed independently rather than combined with other income. Despite the debate over tax cuts for the super-rich, a 35% tax rate is expected to be applied to the highest dividend income bracket. On the other hand, the bill aims to restore tax equity and rebuild the nation's revenue base based on the principle of ability to pay. The country's corporate tax rate will be raised by 1 percentage point across the board, with the top corporate rate increasing to 25%, effectively reversing a cut introduced by the previous administration. The bill also tightens capital gains tax rules by lowering the threshold for major shareholders. While currently only those holding 5 billion won, or roughly $3.6 million in a single listed stock are taxed, that threshold will be reduced to 1 billion won, or just under $720,000. Tax support will be expanded for low and middle income households, with measures such as an increase in the income deduction limit for credit card use by up to 500,000 won, or roughly $360, depending on the number of children for families. The tax burden on self-employed individuals and small business owners is also expected to be alleviated. The bill will first go through cabinet meetings before being submitted to the National Assembly for final approval. Moon Ji-young, Arirang News.
In line with President Lee Jae-myung's decision to move the presidential office back to the Cheong Wa Dae from Yongsan, public access to the compound will be completely suspended starting Friday. This marks the end of a 1,179-day period during which Cheong Wa Dae was open to the public after former President Yoon Suk-yeol opened its gates to the public on May 10, 2022. During that time, nearly 7 million people have visited the historic site. Interest surged in recent months after President Lee won the snap election in June, with the number of visitors in June more than tripling compared to the same period last year. Also, in the 40 days since the election, foot traffic to the Cheong Wa Dae jumped over 240% compared to a year ago.
Good morning, I'm Choi Ji-hee, and this is The World Now. The United States says it will deny visas for officials of the Palestinian Authority and members of the Palestine Liberation Organization. The U.S. State Department announced the sanctions on Thursday under the Middle East Peace Commitments Act and the PLO Commitments Compliance Act. The measures formally deny visas to unspecified members of both the PA and PLO for their alleged efforts to internationalize the conflict with Israel, such as bringing cases to the International Criminal Court. They also coincide with moves by European and North American allies, including Canada, the United Kingdom, and France, to recognize Palestinian statehood at the September UN General Assembly. The White House on the same day made clear that President Trump expressed his dissatisfaction and disagreement with the three allied leaders and views any recognition of Palestinian statehood as rewarding Hamas. Over in Ukraine, the parliament voted unanimously to restore the independence of two key anti-corruption bodies following mass protests. The bill was passed on Thursday during a live stream broadcast of a parliamentary session with a vote of 331-0, reinstating full independence for the National Anti-Corruption Bureau and the Specialized Anti-Corruption Prosecutor's Office. The decision nullified amendments passed on July 22nd that had placed both agencies under the authority of the Prosecutor General. The decision led to some of the most significant protests since Russia's 2022 invasion, with thousands of young Ukrainians taking to the streets of Kyiv and other cities demanding retention of democratic norms. President Volodymyr Zelensky signed the bill into law just hours after the vote, calling the new legislation a guarantee of normal, independent work for anti-corruption bodies and all law enforcement agencies in our state. In the U.S., the White House unveiled on Thursday plans to construct a $200 million state ballroom, marking the first structural addition to the main building since the Truman balcony was added in 1948. The proposed ballroom, also known as the People's House, will be approximately 8,360 square meters in size and accommodate up to 650 seated guests, far exceeding the current 200-person capacity of the East Room. Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt said construction is scheduled to begin this September and is expected to be completed before the end of President Trump's term in early 2029. Funding will come from Trump and other donors. Also in the U.S., the World Meteorological Organization officially certified on Thursday a new world record for the longest lightning flash. The bolt during a storm on October 22, 2017, stretched 829 kilometers from eastern Texas to near Kansas City, Missouri. Such a mega flash occurs in very large storm complexes, or mesoscale convective systems, that can span hundreds of kilometers and last for hours. It was measured using the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's newest geostationary operational environmental satellite, combined with ground-based lightning networks. This flash surpasses the previous record of 768 kilometers, logged in April 2020, also over the southern U.S. plains.
We are in the midst of a record-breaking heat wave. Seoul has now experienced a tropical night for 13 consecutive days, while Sekgipo on Jeju Island has had 17 straight. Heat wave warnings remain in place across much of the country, so today seems to be a repeat of yesterday's sweltering conditions. A bit of cloud coverage was welcome in the capital area yesterday, but blazing sunshine will shine down nationwide today, boosting UV levels to very high levels. And this afternoon, Seoul will be getting up to 36 degrees Celsius. Chuncheon, Gyeongju, Gwangju will be topping out at 35 degrees. But some welcome news, a change is on the way. Rain next week will bring daytime temperatures to the low 30s in the capital area. Until then, if you're feeling drained from the ongoing heat, who isn't? Take it easy, slow down your pace, and don't forget to drink plenty of water.
That's all we have for this morning. Arirang News will be back at 5 p.m. Korea time. Thanks for watching.